Hello and welcome to Biz Talk. I am Danish Manzoor. Today we will talk about an issue which is of grave concern at this point in developing as well as the developed nations across the world, and that would be public transport. Being the lifeline of any major or developing city, public transport is actually something which the world needs to talk about. And UITP is one such organization which has been talking about it for quite some time now. I have with me today the Secretary General of UITP, Mr. Mohamed Mezghani, and let us talk to him and understand from him a little bit more about what UITP does and then dabble a bit into the challenges that the industry faces. Very warm welcome to you on the show.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here.
See, public transport is something which is vital. We call it a basic human right, the mobility factor of it. And when you talk of UITP, we've seen that you've done some really great amount of work in this particular sector. But tell us and our audiences across Asia a little bit more about what you've been doing and the challenges that you've been facing while doing it.
So UITP is the acronym, it's a French acronym of International Association of Public Transport. It's a very old association, born in 1885. At that time, public transport was limited to tramways tracked by horses. So UITP gathers the transport stakeholders or public transport stakeholders, the companies which are operating buses and metros and trains, but also the regulators, the public authorities, and the supplying industry, those manufacturing buses, manufacturing trains, or ticketing systems, for example. So the public transport now is becoming a very hot topic in cities. Actually, urban mobility is becoming a very, very hot topic in cities, and the priority for our cities because urbanization is growing. We have more and more cities, and cities are bigger and bigger. So we need to answer the mobility demand of people, and then public transport is a key for the transport solution. And there are challenges, indeed. There are challenges because the supply in some countries or some cities is not enough. So the metros and the buses are crowded. We don't have enough buses or enough trains. It's also about the traffic congestion. The traffic congestion, which is slowing down the movement of buses, for example, and so it making public transport less attractive. It's about the safety issues in some cases, road safety, for example, in some cases. It's about one of the challenges is the growing digitalization of public transport. We have more and more new technologies in mobility, and these new technologies, they are offering opportunities, of course, because they make the operation more efficient, they make the maintenance less costly, they make the service easier to use.
But then the onboarding costs are high.
Not necessarily, because there is maybe higher cost of investment, but the operational cost, the operating cost is lower. So it's about making the investment to equip with the new technologies, but then it will cost less to operate. But technologies are also changing the expectations of the passengers, because with this technology, with the new apps, they can have on-demand transport, they can have this ride-hailing transport, and so they get used to a transport which is available on demand. And the challenge is to make public transport
almost close to on-demand.
To on-demand and make the service defined from the perspective of the customer, from the expectation of the customer. And this is one of the challenges.
So by and large, if you look at it across the globe, be it developed or developing nations, it has always been centric. It has never really been centric to the customer and the needs of the customer. It's always been about managing their own routes and trying to figure out which routes make most money.
This is the main change now we are experiencing. You're right to say that we used to have a kind of supply-led transport system or a ready-made transport system. We define routes and fixed stops, fixed routes, and a fixed timetable. And now we are moving towards the tailor-made service, but defining the routes and the timetables and the ticketing system, etc., from the perspective of the customers. So having more flexible service, having some, in some cities we have on-demand public transport. I'm not talking about ride-hailing, it's really on-demand public transport, having mini buses on demand, especially in demands, in areas of low density where we cannot justify to have buses with mass transit buses. We can have also ticketing which is different according to the time of the day or the week, by having a special fare for peak hours and by encouraging people to take a train or a bus off-peak. And some cities are even offering free transport off-peak to encourage people to move off-peak, because there we have a capacity of buses which is not used, and then it's better to attract people.
Like, you see, wonderfully said, but then the main issue which I see here is that with public transport, you have to get to a station, be it a bus stop, be it a metro station. Now, the last mile connectivity, as we have been discussing over the past few days as well, the last mile connectivity becomes a major issue over here, because in private transport, any individual doesn't have to worry about that. The vehicle is parked right there, get in the vehicle, even though there's a bit of traffic jam, but still it is on demand for them. They can take it whenever they want to take it. Now, how does the world address the main problem, which is the last mile connectivity?
Indeed, this is a very important problem, because if people, if going to the station or to the stop takes a very long time, or if it is not done in very good conditions, etc., people will not use public transport. And so first, we have to make sure that for those who walk, because this is the most natural, let's say, way of moving, that they walk in safe conditions, in good pavements, and in comfortable conditions. Then we see more and more now bike sharing system. So people, they can take a bike at their the neighborhood of their place, and then cycle until they reach the stop or the stations, and this is one way of ensuring this last mile connectivity. We see now more and more cities having these scooters or e-scooters. Yeah. It is becoming very popular, but there, of course, we need to regulate. We need to make sure it is done in very good conditions. And we see also last mile connectivity with this ride hailing and with this on-demand transport or shuttles. And we see it, but if we want really to make this happen, the last mile connectivity and first mile connectivity, it's important that the ticketing system integrate both the mass transport and this connectivity.
Should be perhaps unified.
Indeed, that in a way that we pay only once, that we have only one smart card or one app we can use for both, because there it will make the use easier, and people will be encouraged to have this door-to-door connection using public modes.
See, you raise a very, very interesting point about the office goers, right? So you want the professionals who want to reach office and their workplaces, which is fine, they travel light. The other breed of travelers is the ones who go for shopping, right? And then when they do go for grocery shopping, they prefer to take the public transport because it gives them the ease of storage as well. Do you think there's also a design problem as well, which has not been really addressed in the public transport system, that it is not equipped to handle the shopping bags, the shopping carts, etc. as well?
Now, for example, for buses or trains serving airports or serving train stations, in many cities we see there are special places, yes, for luggages and in the same carriage. I mean, so they have their luggage. So we need to encourage this kind of equipment for in buses which are serving shopping malls. So this is will come, of course. What we see also is sometimes the shopping malls themselves are organizing the transport. So they have their own buses to encourage people to come to the shopping mall by bus and not by car.
Or the home delivery now.
Or home delivery, etc. So there is a movement to let's say, to help people travel in very comfortable situations and not feel obliged to come by car.
Tell me, what is your personal ideal dream for the future of public transport?
I mean, the future of public transport, I would say, is linked to the future of cities. We cannot think public transport without considering the life in the urban life, the life in cities. And the main challenge there is about how we distribute the road space. between the different modes and the different usages of the road. And what my vision is that we have to limit the place dedicated to cars. You know, when someone wants to smoke, this person should go to a smoking area.
Yeah.
For cars, it's exactly the same. You want to drive a car, you have to go to a special lane for the cars, and the rest is for the other modes, the buses and bikes and scooters and walking, because walking is the priority. So we have to rethink the distribution of space according to the priorities, and the priorities is to move people, not to move vehicles.
Yeah.
And this is how I see the city of the.
Which is actually quite interesting, because when you look at roads and the way they're distributed, especially in developing nations, pedestrian has no right whatsoever in countries like India, in Bangladesh, Nepal, Sri Lanka, all of these nations. So what are you doing to address that? Have you started any work in these particular nations to try and raise the awareness about the value of a pedestrian?
Indeed. I mean, of course, we don't target one nation in particular, but the work we do is of a global dimension. Yeah. And for us, it's very clear that walking is the priority, and it means banning parking of cars on the pavement, because this is something we see often. Sometimes it's for these street sellers who take also the space. So the pedestrian areas are for pedestrians, and we need enforcement. We need enforcement, because this is the issue. If there is no enforcement, people, they will do what they want to do, and then they will not respect the pedestrians. And pedestrians are the priorities, and we really have to think the city differently. And we see many examples of cities who have introduced, for example, tramways, and because the tramways and the pedestrian, they can live together very well, and so they pedestrianized some streets, having the tramway in the middle and the pedestrian on both sides, and so it's a kind of peaceful cohabitation between the different modes.
You said enforcement.
Indeed.
I'm going to hand you an olive branch. What about education? I think that's going to play a major factor, more than enforcement, because living in a civilized society, would we want to be enforcing too much?
No, but you're right. Education is the basis, because if you want to enforce, you have to first tell to people what we want to enforce, and we have to educate them. And also, when we educate, we have to explain. It's not only about giving instructions, but explain the benefits. And explaining the benefits of public transport is also saying that public transport emits 3 to 4 times less CO2 emissions or greenhouse gas emissions or pollution than the private car, for example. And then people will understand, oh, if I travel with public transport, then it is less polluting. So it is part of the education. It's education about the impact on safety. It's education about the impact on health. I mean, why public transport also is encouraged by the World Health Organization? It's because those who use public transport, they walk, and when they walk, it's healthy. So this kind of messages are very important, but it's also educating the political decision makers. It's not just the travelers or the citizens, it's the political decision makers, because one of the challenge we see in some cities that these decision makers, they want to have only short-term projects, fixes, because they are there for 3 or 4 years, and they want to make sure that we deliver projects during.
And they have their name on the,
Indeed, they want to inaugurate. But mobility is a long-term investment. We have to accept that we are investing now, and in 5, 10 years, 15 years, the conditions will be better, and the one who took the decision to invest, he might not be there. Exactly.
Right. So we'll talk about investments, but there's one more problem: the congestion issue in metropolitan cities and major cities across the world is massive. Governments came up with congestion charge. In some places it worked a bit. In most places it ended up as sort of a disaster, because people got used to it and then they started paying more. Of course, the governments made more money. They still do. That money is used for the betterment, but then it didn't solve the basic purpose. So I'll ask you this: congestion charge versus behavioral change communication. What would you prefer?
First, congestion charge. Of course, the immediate effect is a reduction in the traffic. But if we want to sustain this effect, we need to develop an alternative to those who accept not to use their car. And the alternative is to have this public transport and biking and other modes, shared modes. So I would say, if we don't introduce this immediately or even before we have established the congestion charging, the congestion charging will lose its effect.
Yeah.
So it's important. It's a carrot and stick approach. Okay, the carrot is the alternative mode, and the stick is the congestion charging or the parking restriction. So this is very important to have this integrated approach.
Agree. Now, speaking of financing and stuff, in most cities, it's the city, the state, or the government which handles public transport because they see it as a service. But then the element of public-private partnership is also there. Which one do you think would make more sense in the days to come so that the commuter has better mobility, better quality, better service, which is biased towards the commuter and not the other way around?
Public-private partnership could be deployed in many different ways. The first is that we have an authority, public authority, which is responsible to organize transport, and this is very important, and unfortunately in many cities we don't have such authority. So have an authority which is in charge of that, and this authority will delegate the operation to private operators, because the private operators, they have the experience to, but based on the rules defined by the authority. It's not deregulating. It's not just giving the freedom to the operator to do what they want. This is one way of public-private partnership. But the public-private partnership could be also in the way we develop the infrastructure by involving the private investors in developing the infrastructure, and they are then get a return on their investment by the operation of the system.
But that return part, good you mentioned it. I'm sorry, I'm sort of cutting you short here. But then the problem here is that in many cities, we've seen that in PPP models, what happens is the returns happen over a long period of time for the investment, right? In some cases that I've spoken to some of these investors, they're like, it's really not worth it because, if we put our money elsewhere, it's going to make us 3 times more money. But if we put money here, it's going to take a long time for us to make money.
It takes a long time, but this is I would say the nature of public transport projects, especially if you invest in bus system, it will take less time than investing in a metro system. But the companies who are involved in this are companies who are developing infrastructure, who are developing long-term investments, so they are used to this kind of investment. I don't think they are surprised because it's not generating revenues immediately. Maybe one additional aspect of public-private partnership or how to involve the private sector in the development of public transport is about, for example, land value capture. Land value capture means that when you build the metro, we realize that the value of the properties around the metro stations or the land around the metro stations, the value increases. And though the land developer didn't put $1 in the investment of public transport. So it's important that we find a way to make those land developers or real estate developers pay part of their revenues to develop public transport.
Is the world ready for autonomous transportation at this juncture?
Autonomous transportation offers a lot of benefits. And one of them, for me, is that it reduces the cost of operating transport. And also it improves safety, definitely. The problem is how we make these autonomous vehicles share the street with the regular vehicles. And we are not ready yet for that. So what we see now is some experimentations of autonomous vehicles, but in dedicated or protected lanes.
I completely agree with you. There are some legal issues as well in terms of compliances and stuff. But what is stopping us from, making the metros and trains autonomous?
The first autonomous metro was put in operation in Japan in 1982. And now we have reached 1,100 kilometers of autonomous metros. You have it in Paris, in Singapore, in Japan, in Dubai, the metro is autonomous. In Saudi Arabia, they are building 6 metro lines which are all autonomous. So there is a number of cities who have autonomous metros, and the technology is very well controlled, I would say. The next step will be autonomous buses. And this, I think, we will have autonomous buses before even we have autonomous cars, because buses, they can be in reserved lanes, separated from the general traffic. And one word about autonomous vehicles is that if we just replace the existing cars by autonomous cars, or if we just take off the driver from the car, we will not solve the congestion issue. So it's important that autonomous vehicles are shared and they are complementing mass transit, and which will remain the backbone.
Clean diesel versus electric, what do you favor?
First is when we introduce public transport, is already, and if we transfer people from car to public transport, it's already cleaner. It's already cleaner. Okay, then if we do it, let's do it with the clean vehicles. Diesel now, if there are standards for diesel, and one of is they call Euro 1, Euro 2, these are European standards, but now they are adopted worldwide. The last standard, the latest one, is Euro 6, and this is already very clean. But cities, they want cleaner even. And so they decide, most of them or some of them, to adopt electric buses. And we see deployment of electric buses in the world. There are now about 450,000 electric buses in the world. But we have to see also from where it comes, this electricity. If it comes from coal,
it makes sense,
it will, I would say, it will make a little impact in the city itself, because in general the power plant is outside of the city. But for the global warming, it doesn't change anything. So it's important that the electricity is also produced using a clean technology. And the other aspect is that if a clean bus is stuck in traffic, it doesn't make it more attractive than a diesel bus. So it's important that the priority is to give the priority to the buses over cars, and then if we can have them electric, why not?
Yeah. So the other issue over here would be, in autonomous vehicles and stuff, for instance, would be the element of cybersecurity. Now, the security elements there are of paramount importance, because what if somebody were to hijack in the situations what we see in the world today? Do you think that could be a challenge that the industry will have?
It is a challenge, of course, in all industries, not just in transportation industry, in the banking industry, in the telecom industry. Cybersecurity is a challenge, and that's why we need to design systems which can prevent these attacks. Where also systems where there is a redundancy of the equipment, that in case there is a problem we can use the alternate equipment. We need also the skills, the right people to control this.
To move them from banking perhaps into
exactly. Right. I mean, in transport we compete with other, because they are not the transport experts. We don't need transport experts for that. We need cybersecurity experts, and so we have to compete with other sectors. And the challenge for us in public transport is to make our sector attractive enough, and to strengthen our brand as employer, to make them come. But the cybersecurity is certainly an issue, but the technology and the knowledge is also progressing rapidly.
You spoke about making it an attractive employer.
Indeed.
But from what we know, I think I saw one of your tweets, around 14% of women make up for the women workforce in public transport overall. Do you think that is a challenge, and how should the world be addressing it?
No, it is a challenge, but an opportunity, because if we have only 14%,
which means
the potential is high to have more women in public transport.
There needs to be intent to do that.
Yes, and that's why we need really to encourage these women to come. We need also to, I give you one example. There is one company in Canada, in the city of Montreal, the transport operators there. In their recruitment, they now have panels to interview candidates, and in the panel they decided to have women and men in the panels, because they used to have only men in the panels, and they noticed that now they're recruiting more women. So sometimes very simple measures,
small tweaks,
could encourage the employment of women. And also public transport majority in some countries, and maybe not in India, but in some countries, the majority of the travelers are women. And it's important that those who work in the sector, they reflect also those who use the public transport.
Absolutely. Well, my last question to you before we wrap up today's interesting session would be, looking at developing nations at this point of time, since you've seen it globally, since you're involved in this 24/7, literally, in the sector of mobility, What do you think that the developing nations should keep in mind in the years to come when it comes to mobility and public transport?
No, they should really have an approach where they think about the city, about how to make the city more people-friendly, how to make the city cleaner, how to make the city more attractive, how to make the city more economically dynamic and more better quality of life in this city. And if we have an approach with this in mind, we will automatically go towards this type of mobility with public transport, with shared modes, with clean modes, with walking, with cycling. So it's the development of this kind of approach that will make the city a better place to live in, and the city which is economically much more growing and attracting more tourism, more business, and creating more jobs in the city.
Mr. Secretary General, it was a pleasure having you on the show, and I hope that in the days to come that governments across the world encourage public transport and the use of public transport, especially in the developing nations. That would be all for today. I'll see you again very soon. Till then, do take good care of yourselves.